The barn had always been there, hunched against the far edge of the property like an old watchdog, weather-beaten but stubbornly holding its ground. The man had grown up with it, playing hide-and-seek in its hayloft as a boy, stacking bales as a teenager, and eventually taking on the responsibility of keeping it upright after his father passed. For decades, the barn was background, never threatening, never mysterious, just part of the daily rhythm of rural life. Its wood smelled of dust and dry clover. Its rafters groaned when the wind pressed hard against the valley. Familiar, ordinary, unchanging. That was why the strangeness caught him off guard. It wasn't sudden or obvious, not like a thunderstorm tearing through the roof. It began quietly, with something he couldn't quite name. On certain mornings when he opened the heavy doors, a cool current of air slid across the dirt floor and coiled around his ankles. At first he thought it was a wind sneaking through a crack in the wall, but even on still days the draft lingered. The animal seemed to sense it too. The old mare, usually content to nose around in her stall, grew restless near the southern end of the barn. Chickens gathered at the opposite side, refusing to scratch in their usual spot. He dismissed it as nothing. Animals spooked easily, but their unease gnawed at him. One afternoon, after setting down a heavy feed sack, he noticed a sound. He had dropped it hard enough to rattle the boards, but instead of the dull thud he expected, there was a faint echo like a hollow drum. He crouched, pressed his palm against the floor, and tapped again. The sound returned, empty, unnatural. He froze, his skin prickling. His father's voice rose in memory. "Keep the barn sound, son. Don't let it rot under your watch." But this wasn't rot. It was something else. Something hidden. Curiosity wrestled with dread. He fetched a crowbar from the tool rack, hesitated, then levered it against a warped plank. It resisted at first, as though the barn itself wanted to keep it secret. Then with a shriek of old nails, the board lifted. Dust puffed into his face, and beneath it, in the dim light, he saw the mouth of a hole. It was not just a hollow pocket of earth. This was deliberate. He could see the squared edges of stone lining the shaft, and a set of narrow steps descending into blackness. His heart pounded. Who had carved this? Why? He leaned closer, gripping the edge of the floor for balance. The air that rose from below was different. Cool, damp, carrying the mineral tang of deep soil. It smelled older than the barn, older than the farm itself. For a moment, instinct screamed at him to cover it back up, to nail the boards tight and forget what he had seen. But the longer he stood there, staring into the dark throat of the passage, the stronger his fascination grew. He felt almost as if the hole were watching him in return, patient and inviting. No good comes from digging into the past, he thought, echoing one of his father's old warnings. Yet another voice stirred inside him, quieter but insistent. If you don't go down, you'll never know. The sun slanted through the high windows, gilding the dust motes drifting in the air. The rest of the barn was just as it had always been. Tools hanging on nails, hay stacked neat, the old mare stamping her hoof. But now all of it felt flimsy, like scenery painted over a deeper reality. He sat back on his heels, staring into the hidden stairway. A chill spread through his chest. There are moments in a life when a man understands that he has come to a door he cannot close again. He recognized it in that instant. Once he descended, he would not return the same. He knew it as surely as he knew the smell of hay and dust, as surely as he knew the barn itself. And still, his hand reached for the lantern. The lantern hissed as he lit it, casting a trembling glow across the stone-lined shaft. Shadows leapt against the barn walls, stretching and shrinking with every flicker of the flame. He held it over the opening, expecting to see the bottom just a few feet down. Instead, the light dissolved into darkness, swallowed whole as though the earth itself refused to give up its secrets. He lowered himself slowly, boots testing the first step. The stone was slick with condensation, colder than the autumn air above. For a moment, he hesitated, one foot still anchored on the barn floor, the other planted on the stair. The divide between his ordinary life and whatever waited below had never felt sharper. Then he released his grip, and the weight of his body tilted forward, carrying him into the earth. The descent was tight, each step carved narrower than the last, forcing him to angle his shoulders and duck his head. The lantern light painted the walls in honeyed arcs, revealing streaks of mineral deposits and veins of darker stone. Water dripped somewhere in the distance, a slow rhythm that seemed to echo through the confined space. He counted the steps without meaning to. 10, 20, 30. By 40, his thighs burned, and still the tunnel pressed down. It felt impossibly long, far deeper than any root cellar or storm shelter his family might have built. The air thick and damp and cool, filling his lungs with the scent of clay and decay. At last, the staircase leveled out into a narrow corridor. The ceiling was low, forcing him to stoop, and the walls bore the marks of deliberate hands. These weren't natural formations. The stone had been cut, smooth in some places, and etched in others. He lifted the lantern closer. Strange grooves lined the surface, patterns that might have been symbols or might have been the careless gouges of tools. But the more he studied them, the less random they seemed. There was repetition, curves mirrored by angles, spirals woven into straight lines. He could not read them, but he felt them the way one feels the rhythm of a song, without knowing the words. He pressed on, his boots crunching on gravel. The tunnel forked once, then again, each path narrowing into blackness. He paused at the first intersection, heart thudding, unsure which way to turn. The left-hand passage carried a faint draft, brushing against his skin like a whisper. The right-hand path stood still and heavy, as though it had been sealed by time. He chose the draft. Movement, even invisible, felt safer than silence. The passage curved downward, tighter still, forcing him nearly to crawl. His lantern threw wild shadows, and more than once he thought he glimpsed movement in the corner of his eye, a flicker, a retreating shape. But when he turned, there was only rock. Sweat trickled down his temples despite the chill. The sounds grew stranger. At first, only water and his own breathing. But then, something else. A low hum, faint, almost imperceptible. It might have been a resonance of the earth itself, or it might have been something alive, something distant yet drawing nearer. He paused, holding his breath, and the hum seemed to pulse in the silence like a heartbeat. His grip tightened on the lantern handle. He wanted to turn back, to climb those endless steps and slam the barn boards shut forever. But when he pictured the shaft above, the thought curdled in his stomach. The idea of retreat felt impossible, as though the passage had stretched in his absence, sealing behind him. Forward, then, always forward. The walls shifted again, the stone giving way to wooden supports darkened with age. Here, the tunnel looked less ancient, more practical, as though someone had worked to reinforce it. Nails rusted in the beams, some bent, others driven at odd angles. A collapsed shovel leaned against the wall, its handle half-rotted, metal blade eaten by rust. He knelt to inspect it, fingers brushing the splintered wood. It wasn't modern. It wasn't his father's, nor his grandfather's. The tool had been left long ago, by hands that never returned to claim it. Rising again, he lifted the lantern higher, and the tunnel stretched ahead into deeper blackness, the hum louder now, no longer background but something deliberate, something waiting. He took another step, then another, the earth pressing close around him, until all sense of barn, of sunlight, of the ordinary world above was gone. The tunnel was his world now. Stone, shadow, and the endless downward pull of mystery. The hum grew steadier as he moved forward, no longer faint but pulsing in rhythm with his steps, as though the tunnel itself had found a voice. He gripped the lantern tighter, its trembling glow struggling to keep pace with the deepening dark. The passage widened, the ceiling lifting overhead until he could stand upright again. His spine cracked as he straightened, relief quickly replaced by unease. Wide space meant unknown space. Wide space meant room for things unseen. Then, after what felt like miles of crawling through earth, the tunnel opened abruptly into a vast chamber. He stopped at the threshold, breath caught in his throat. The lantern light stretched weakly, licking the edges of the cavern but never filling it. Shadows loomed in arches across the stone walls, and the ceiling soared out of sight. Something glimmered, not gold or silver, but a dull phosphorescence that seemed to live within the rock itself. Patches of stone glowed faintly, veins of pale green light, winding like frozen lightning. Bioluminescent fungi clung to the walls, casting eerie halos that made his lantern seem small, almost unnecessary. In the center of the chamber lay a structure. At first he thought it was an altar, stone slabs stacked in deliberate symmetry. But as he edged closer, he realized it was something stranger. The stones were arranged in spirals, layers upon layers, all curling inward to a hollow pit at the core. Bones littered the spirals, animal bones, yes, but also others longer, thinner, disturbingly human-like. His stomach clenched. He stepped back, pulse hammering, but his eyes refused to look away. Every instinct screamed at him to leave, yet something deeper held him. The spiral seemed to draw his gaze inward, downward, until he found himself staring into the hollow center. The hum grew louder. No, it wasn't just sound. It was vibration. The ground beneath his boots trembled with it, subtle but undeniable, as though the earth were breathing. He staggered, the lantern swinging wildly, shadows jerking across the cavern walls. For a moment, he thought he saw movement within the spiral pit. Something shifting in the darkness, something rising. He forced himself to blink, to focus. Nothing. Only the hollow center, yawning like an open mouth. His mind scrambled for explanation. Maybe this was an old ritual site, dug by settlers or forgotten cult. Maybe it was geological, some natural formation he didn't understand. But no, those bones, those deliberate spirals, they weren't chance. Someone had built this, tended it, fed it. The air thickened, pressing against his skin. He felt watched, not in the vague way he had earlier, but with sharp precision, as if unseen eyes had locked on him. The hairs on his arms stood stiff, his chest tight. Then the whispers came. At first they blended with the hum, almost indistinguishable, but soon they separated, distinct voices threading through the vibration. Low, fragmented syllables, not in any language he knew. They rose and fell, overlapping, echoing from the stone until he couldn't tell if they came from the spiral, the walls, or from inside his own skull. He clapped a hand over his ear. The sound didn't stop. Memory flickered. His father warning him never to dig where you don't belong. His grandfather's stories about hollow places under the valley that swallowed men whole. He had laughed at those stories once, called them backwoods superstition. But here, now, with the whispers crawling through his head, he realized they hadn't been stories at all. They had been warnings. The lantern flame sputtered, guttered low. His heart jolted. If the light died, he wasn't sure he would survive the dark. He shook it, coaxing the flame higher, but the shadows seemed to press harder, encroaching from every side. He backed toward the tunnel, each step a battle against the pull of the spiral. His body wanted to flee, but his mind leaned forward, desperate to look again, to listen closer. A sick fascination bloomed inside him, whispering that if he just stepped into the spiral, just looked a little deeper, he might finally understand what this place was. He stopped at the cavern's edge, chest heaving, torn between two hungers, the primal urge to escape and the terrible desire to know. The whispers swelled, a chorus now, their syllables coiling around his thoughts. His lantern flared suddenly, brighter than before, as if fed by some unseen breath. In its flare, he glimpsed something in the spiral pit, movement unmistakable this time. A shape, long and sinuous, unfurling in the darkness. He stumbled back, choking on fear, yet his eyes clung to the sight. Something was waking, and he realized with cold clarity that he had come too far. He would never leave this place untouched. Even if he managed to climb back to the barn, even if he nailed the board shut and tried to forget, the tunnel would live inside him now. Because once you've looked into the dark never stops looking back. He didn't remember turning to run. One moment, he was staring into the pit, the whispers curling tighter around his skull. The next, his boots were pounding against stone, lantern clutched like a lifeline as he stumbled back into the tunnel. The hum followed. It wasn't fading with distance. If anything, it grew sharper, vibrating in his bones, rattling his teeth. He imagined it shaking loose his memories, stripping his thoughts until all that remained was the sound. The tunnel seemed longer than before, twisting in ways it hadn't on the way down. Corners appeared where he remembered straight lines, forks where there should have been none. He tried to retrace his steps toward the staircase, but every turn felt wrong, every shadow unfamiliar. His breath came in ragged bursts, echoing against the walls like someone else was running just behind him. At last, his lantern light caught the slick curve of the staircase. Relief struck, so hard it made his knees weak. He clutched the railing and began to climb. Step after step, he rose, lungs burning, fingers scraping against cold stone. The air grew lighter, drier, and with each foot gained, the hum receded. Not gone, never gone, but muffled like a memory he couldn't shake. Finally, he emerged through the opening, dragging himself onto the barn floor. He lay there for a long time, gasping, the lantern flickering beside him, dust swirling in the pale slant of afternoon sun. The mare stamped nervously in her stall. Chickens clucked uneasily, and everything, the tools, the hay, the walls, looked exactly the same as before. But it wasn't. The barn no longer felt like home. Its creaks were whispers. Its shadows leaned longer than they should. The boards beneath him vibrated faintly, or maybe it was his own bones that trembled. Either way, he knew the tunnel was still there, alive just beneath the surface. He thought of sealing it again, hammering the boards tight, burying it under dirt and stone, pretending it had never existed. But the idea rang hollow. The tunnel wasn't something you could cover. It had taken root in him. That night, he tried to sleep in his house, but the silence pressed too heavily. He tossed in bed, listening to the stillness, until finally he realized it wasn't silent at all. Beneath the floorboards, beneath the soil, the hum was still there, faint but steady, like a heartbeat that belonged to something vast and patient. When dawn came, he returned to the barn. He stood over the loose boards, lantern in hand, staring at the dark mouth below. He didn't open it. Not yet. But he couldn't walk away either. Hours passed with him just standing there, caught between fear and compulsion. Neighbors noticed changes in him. At the feed store, he kept his eyes low, answering questions with half-mumbled words. Folks asked if he was sick, if the farm was too much for him alone. He nodded politely, but inside, their voices sounded thin and distant, drowned out by the constant low vibration in his mind. He stopped going into town altogether. Days blurred into nights, each one stitched together by the unshakable presence of the tunnel. Sometimes he swore he heard his name carried in the hum. Sometimes he dreamed of spirals glowing in the dark, of bones shifting to make room for something moving beneath them. And sometimes, when the dreams were too vivid, he woke with dirt under his nails and the faint taste of stone on his tongue, though he didn't remember leaving his bed. The barn stood quiet on the hill, weathered and ordinary to anyone passing by. But inside, beneath the warped planks, the earth waited. And so did he. He no longer wondered if he would go back down. He knew he would. It was only a matter of time. For once you find the dark, you don't choose to return. It chooses you. He had found a tunnel under his barn, entered it. And though he had climbed back into the sunlight, he knew with a terrible certainty that he had never truly come back. Not the same. Not ever.